There are disappearances that leave silence behind, and then there are the ones that leave answers. The kind of answers no one in Harlan County, Virginia ever wanted to find. This is the story of a man who vanished from the largest tobacco plantation in the county one September night in 1857, leaving no broken lock, no disturbed earth, no trail through the dew-wet grass. A man who had been, by every account, the most trusted, most valued, most beloved servant that Harlan Voss had ever owned. And when the weeks passed with no word, no body, no trace, the people of that county told themselves the worst had already happened. They were wrong. What came next was not a body in a field or a fugitive caught at the border. What came next dismantled everything. The plantation, the family, the lie that an entire community had agreed to believe. And the most disturbing part of all is this: every piece of what you're about to hear was written down, recorded in ink, on paper, in the careful hand of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly how long it would take for anyone to understand. Before we continue with the story of Elias and the Voss plantation, if you are listening to this right now, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have the notification bell turned on. Stories like this one don't come along often, and I want you here for every single one of them. Drop a comment below and tell me what state or country you're watching from. Let's see where in the world our listeners are tonight. Now, let's go back to Virginia. September 1857. There was a particular kind of afternoon light that fell over Linmore Plantation in the late summer, the kind that turns tobacco leaves into sheets of hammered copper and makes the whole world seem paused between one breath and the next. It was beautiful, in the way that things built on crooked foundations sometimes are, dazzling from the outside, deeply wrong from within. Linmore sat on 460 acres of rolling Virginia land in what is now Harlan County, though in those years it was simply spoken of as the Voss land, because in that part of the county the Voss name meant something close to absolute. Harlan Voss had inherited the plantation from his father, Clement Voss, who had himself built it from a modest tobacco farm in the 1820s into one of the most productive operations in the region. By the time Harlan was 35 and running it himself, Linmore had 62 enslaved people, a processing barn that ran 6 days a week from April through October, a 2-story great house with white columns that you could see from the main road half a mile away, and a reputation for being well managed, which, in the parlance of the planter class, meant it ran on time and turned a profit. Harlan Voss was not a man who inspired love. He was a man who inspired compliance, which he believed was the same thing. He was tall, slightly heavy in his middle years, with a wide forehead, and the kind of steady grey eyes that gave him the appearance of calm reason even when he was anything but calm. He attended church every Sunday, shook the right hands, gave modestly to local charity, and maintained, with great deliberate effort, the image of a man who was fair. He liked to say, often in the company of other planters, that good management required good relationships, that a man who governed his workers well had nothing to fear. He said this with such conviction that many people around him believed it. Some of them, perhaps, still do. But there was one name on Linmore Plantation that was spoken differently from all the others. One name that carried a weight and a texture that set it apart from the daily routine of field calls and ledger entries. That name was Elias. Elias had been on Linmore since he was roughly 9 years old, brought from a smaller farm outside Richmond when Clement Voss was still alive and believed in purchasing young. He was, by the time our story begins, a man of about 32, though no official record of his birth date existed. Like most enslaved people of the era, his age was estimated, not known. He was lean, of medium height, with careful dark eyes that seemed to be perpetually measuring something just beyond the immediate conversation. He moved through the plantation with an unhurried, deliberate quality that some people found unsettling and others found reassuring, depending on which side of the authority they stood on. What made Elias exceptional in the eyes of Harlan Voss was not his physical strength, though he was capable enough, and not his particular skill in the tobacco barn, though he knew the curing process with genuine precision. What made Elias exceptional was something rarer and more valuable to a man like Harlan Voss. He could read. He could write. He could calculate figures in his head with a speed that made the Voss bookkeeper, a wiry man named Clement Briggs, openly uncomfortable. And he did all of this without ever being asked to display it, without ever performing it for visitors, without ever using it in a way that threatened the architecture of power that surrounded him. No one was entirely certain how Elias had learned. Clement Voss, the original patriarch, had apparently taught him letters as a kind of experiment. A common enough conceit among certain planters of the earlier period who imagined themselves to be progressive men while engaging in the most regressive institution their civilization had ever produced. Whatever the origin, by the time Harlan inherited the plantation, Elias could read any document placed before him, write in a clear and practiced hand, and had a working knowledge of basic accounting that Harlan eventually turned to professional use. He was, in the language of the time, a house slave, though at Linmore his role was something more layered than that phrase typically suggested. He served in the Great House, yes, managing the household accounts under Harlan's supervision, occasionally translating the practical requirements of the fieldwork into the neat columns of the plantation ledger when Briggs was ill or otherwise unavailable. He accompanied Harlan Voss on trips to the county seat. He was, on at least 3 documented occasions in letters that survive from that period, introduced by Harlan to business associates as "my man Elias, who keeps things in order." There was a particular quality to Harlan's relationship with Elias that many people noticed but few spoke openly about. It was not friendship. The social structure of the time made that an impossibility that both men would have denied with different levels of conviction. It was something more complicated, something that operated in the space between ownership and dependency, between trust and control. Harlan needed Elias in a way that quietly embarrassed him, and Elias understood that need with a clarity that he had spent years learning to keep entirely invisible. The other enslaved people at Linmore watched this dynamic the way you watch a tightly wound mechanism, with the instinctive understanding that the tension inside it is enormous, and that when it finally releases, the motion will be swift. Among them, Elias was regarded with a complicated mixture of respect and careful distance. He was not a collaborator, not in the way that the overseer's favorite informants were, the ones who repeated conversations and earned small privileges through betrayal. Everyone on Linmore understood, without it ever being said directly, that Elias was not that. But they also understood that his position gave him access to things no one else had access to. He knew the numbers. He knew the accounts. He knew what Harlan Voss said when he thought no one who mattered was listening. And in those years on that plantation, knowledge was the most dangerous thing a person could possess. A woman named Ruth, who worked in the processing barn and had been at Linmore for 20 years, later described Elias in the following terms, recorded in a sworn deposition in 1859, which we will return to in time. She said, "He was always watching, not the way some watch like they're looking for trouble. More like he was reading something the rest of us couldn't see. Like he was always on the last page of a book no one else had been given." That description, offered under the pressure of a legal proceeding and recorded by a county clerk who almost certainly did not understand what he was transcribing, is perhaps the most precise account of Elias that survives. And when you understand what happened next, it is impossible to read Ruth's words without feeling the particular chill of a person who had been standing next to something extraordinary and had sensed its presence without ever quite naming it. The summer of 1857 had been a productive one at Linmore. The tobacco crop was the strongest in 4 years. The curing barn had run without significant incident, and Harlan Voss was in the kind of expansive mood that came only when the numbers moved in the right direction. He had been speaking with some frequency that summer about expansion, a parcel of land to the north, adjacent to the property, that he believed could be acquired from the Doyle family, who were in the early stages of a financial difficulty that most of the county already knew about, even if the Doyles did not yet acknowledge it themselves. It was a familiar pattern in that part of Virginia in those years. Land changed hands through the slow gravity of debt, and men like Harlan Voss positioned themselves at the bottom of that gravity and waited. Elias managed the household accounts with the same careful attention he brought to everything. The ledger for that summer, one of several that would later become central to events that no one in Harlan County could have anticipated, recorded the ordinary expenses of a large household in meticulous detail. Flour and salt pork purchased in bulk from the county merchant. Replacement hardware for the barn. The salary of Dale Pruitt, the overseer, paid monthly in the amount of $40. The periodic fees charged by Dr. Waverly of Coopersville, who visited the plantation for medical matters. The cost of new shoes for the people who worked the fields, distributed twice a year, always a month later than they were needed. To anyone reading that ledger in the ordinary course of business, it was an unremarkable document. The kind of record that hundreds of plantations kept in hundreds of counties across hundreds of miles of southern soil. The kind of record that spoke entirely in the language of property, things owned, things purchased, things consumed, things maintained. But Elias, it would later emerge, had been keeping another ledger. Not in place of the official one, that remained precise, accurate, and available for Harlan Voss to review at any moment, which he did regularly, often in the evenings after supper when the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. No, the second ledger was something else entirely. Its existence would not become known for weeks after the night Elias disappeared. And when it did become known, the process of understanding what it contained would take considerably longer still. None of this, of course, was suspected on the warm September evening when Harlan Voss sat on the covered porch of the great house, drinking bourbon that had been poured for him by a young man named George and reading a letter from his cotton trading associate in Richmond. Harlan was in good spirits. The accounts were clean. The crop was nearly in. The Doyle land would be his by Christmas, he was nearly certain of it. Everything, as he surveyed it from his porch in the long amber light of that late afternoon, was in order. He asked George where Elias was, and George said he believed Elias was in the counting room, the small office at the rear of the great house where the plantation's paperwork was kept. Harlan nodded, satisfied. He returned to his letter. A nightbird called somewhere in the oak trees that lined the drive, and the tobacco fields beyond the fence rustled with a low, dry sound like paper turning. By the time Harlan Voss went to bed that night, nothing appeared to be wrong. The great house was quiet. The quarters beyond the fence were dark and still. Elias had brought the evening ledger to Harlan's study at the usual hour, 8 o'clock, placed it on the corner of the desk as he always did, and said good night. Harlan had not looked up from the paper he was reading. That was the last time anyone on Linmore Plantation saw Elias. Harlan Voss discovered the absence himself, which was unusual. Normally, the household moved through its morning routine with the kind of practiced precision that long familiarity produces. Coffee appeared, fires were laid, the day's arrangements were confirmed. All of it managed largely through Elias, who organized the household staff with a quiet authority that Harlan had never needed to supervise directly. That morning, September 9th, 1857, Harlan came down the main stairs at his usual time of 6:30 and found the house cold and the coffee unmade. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. The quality of the silence was wrong. Not the silence of a house before it wakes, but the silence of a house that is missing something it doesn't know how to name yet. He called for Elias. He called twice. The third time his voice was different, still controlled, but with a tightness at the edges that George, who slept in the small room off the kitchen, heard from behind his closed door and recognized immediately as something to be afraid of. Within an hour, it was established that Elias was not in the great house, not in the quarters, not in the processing barn, not in the counting room. His sleeping area, a small room adjacent to the kitchen that was, by the standards of the time and place, unusually private for an enslaved person, was neat, undisturbed, his single change of clothes still folded on the shelf above his cot. His shoes were missing. His coat was missing. Nothing else appeared to be gone. Harlan Voss sent for Dale Pruitt before breakfast. Pruitt was a lanky, weathered man of 43, who had been Linmore's overseer for 8 years and who, by every account available, was neither cruel nor kind, but strictly transactional. A man who managed the plantation's labor through the precise application of incentive and consequence without any particular personal investment in either. He arrived at the Great House within 20 minutes of being summoned, hat in hand, already calculating what had happened before Harlan said a word. "He's gone," Harlan said simply. Pruitt nodded once. The two men stood in the hallway near the front door, and Pruitt asked the question that any man in his position would ask first. "How long do you figure?" "Sometime last night. He was here at 8. Pruitt did the arithmetic. 10 hours, perhaps 11. Not an insurmountable head start, but not nothing either. He asked about any recent behavior that might indicate it had been planned, any unusual quietness, any unexplained absences over the previous weeks, any contact with people from outside the plantation." Harlan answered each question with a controlled precision that was itself a kind of performance. The behavior of a man who was already managing how this event would be perceived from the outside, rather than simply responding to it. The answer to most of Pruitt's questions was no. There had been nothing unusual. Elias had been exactly as he always was, present, efficient, attentive. He had given no indication of anything. That, as it turned out, was the thing that would haunt Harlan Voss more than almost anything else that followed. Pruitt organized a search of the immediate property that morning. The fields, the woods on the eastern side, the creek that ran along the southern boundary. He sent word to the neighboring farms and to the county constable's office in Coopersville. By midday, a notice had been prepared describing Elias, his approximate age, his height, the fact that he could read and write, which was included because it was considered relevant information both for identification and for the calculation of what kind of fugitive they were dealing with. That detail, that he could read and write, carried a particular weight in how the search was organized and discussed. A man who could read and write could navigate. He could interpret road signs, purchase tickets at a coach station under a false pretense, compose a letter that might secure him assistance. He was not simply a body that had moved from one location to another. He was a thinking, planning presence that had gone somewhere deliberately. This was understood by everyone involved in the search, even if it was spoken about only obliquely. Harlan Voss offered a reward of $200, a significant sum in 1857, enough to motivate serious effort from any number of men in the county who made their living from such work. The notice was posted at the county seat, at the Coopersville post office, and at a number of crossroads taverns throughout the region. And then the waiting began. The first week produced nothing. No credible sighting, no captured man, no report from any of the roads or coach stations that a man matching Elias's description had passed through. The county constable, a broad, slow-moving man named Ferris, who had dealt with many such situations over the course of his tenure, told Harlan that this was not unusual. Many fugitives made for the Ohio River, which was 300 miles north, using the darkness and the back roads and the assistance of what Ferris, in the careful language of official correspondence, referred to as sympathetic parties. The journey could take 2 weeks or more for someone traveling carefully. It was entirely possible that Elias had not yet crossed any checkpoint where he might be recognized. Harlan nodded and thanked Ferris for his assessment and returned to Linmore. He ran the plantation. He managed the final weeks of the tobacco harvest. He dined with his wife, Catherine, a quiet woman from a good Fredericksburg family who had learned over the years of their marriage to read Harlan's moods with the precision of someone who had no other choice, and who understood from the particular quality of his silence in those days that what had happened with Elias was not simply a matter of lost property. It was something more personal than that, though Harlan would never have admitted this to anyone, least of all to himself. Catherine Voss was, in the surviving record, a peripheral figure, mentioned in letters, noted in accounts, never fully present. She appears to have been a woman of considerable intelligence, who had long since learned to deploy it entirely in the domestic sphere, which was the only sphere available to her. She managed the household with the same invisible competence that Elias had managed the accounts. and the two of them had developed over the years a kind of professional mutual regard, a working relationship built on the shared understanding that certain things at Linmore functioned properly only because they made them function properly. In the days following Elias's disappearance, Catherine noticed something that she would not mention to anyone for nearly a month. It was a small thing, possibly meaningless, but she noticed that the counting room, Elias's domain, the place where the plantation's paperwork lived in its neat ordered stacks, had a particular quality to its order in those days after he left. The desk was clear. The ledgers were precisely stacked. The ink and pen were capped and set in their tray. Everything was in its place. In 6 years of watching Elias work in that room, Catherine had never once seen the desk completely clear. There was always something in progress, a column being added, a receipt being copied, a letter being drafted. Elias was a man of perpetual quiet industry. A clear desk, in his case, was not the natural end state of a workday. It was the deliberate end state of something else entirely. She said nothing, whether from uncertainty or from some private intuition that the clarity she observed in those neat stacks was a kind of message she did not yet know how to interpret. Catherine Voss kept her observation to herself. She would later describe this decision, in a private letter to her sister in Fredericksburg, as the thing she most regretted. Meanwhile, on the plantation itself, the absence of Elias created a logistical problem that was immediately apparent and a social problem that was slower to surface. The immediate problem was the accounts. There was no one else at Linmore who could manage the household ledger with the same competence, which meant that Harlan was forced to take a more direct role in the record-keeping, assisted by Briggs, who came up from his room in the processing barn in the evenings with an air of reluctant inconvenience. The social problem was more diffuse, a shift in the quality of the atmosphere among the people who lived and worked at Linmore. Pruitt noticed it. He described it later as a kind of watchfulness that came over the quarters. Not the dangerous, explosive quality of genuine unrest, but something quieter and more sustained. A sense of people waiting for something, the nature of which he couldn't define. He asked one of the older field men about it, obliquely, the way an overseer asks about things he doesn't want to seem concerned about. The man said nothing useful, which Pruitt expected, but the watchfulness itself continued, and after a while Pruitt simply noted it in his mental catalogue of things at Linmore that he couldn't explain and moved on. Ruth worked in the processing barn and said nothing. George served meals in the great house and said nothing. A young woman named Nora, who had come to Linmore 2 years earlier from a farm sale in Augusta County, watched the counting room door through the kitchen window when she thought no one was observing her, and said nothing. The silence among the enslaved people of Linmore that October was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of people who understood that the shape of what was coming had not yet fully revealed itself, and that when it did, the less they had said, the better. 3 weeks after Elias's disappearance, a constable's rider came to Linmore with a report that a man matching the description, lean, dark-eyed, well-spoken, had been seen at a ferry crossing on the Shenandoah River, about 80 miles to the northwest. The report was second or third hand, passed through a chain of county offices, and its details were vague enough that Pruitt thought it might be nothing. But Harlan Voss seized on it with a ferocity that surprised even Pruitt, who had seen Harlan angry before and knew the particular shape of his determination. Harlan rode north personally. He was gone 4 days. He returned without Elias, without any definitive confirmation that the sighting had been genuine, and in a mood that Catherine could feel from 2 rooms away. He sat in his study for the better part of an evening with the door closed, and in the morning he called Pruitt in and gave quiet, specific instructions that the search be continued with renewed effort and that the reward be raised to $300. $300 in 1857 in Harlan County, Virginia, was a sum that made men go still and quiet when they heard it. It was more than Pruitt made in 7 months. It was a figure that communicated not just financial motivation, but something raw and less rational, the signal that this particular disappearance had broken through whatever professional composure Harlan Voss maintained in ordinary circumstances. People noticed. The kind of men who paid attention to the reward notices at the county courthouse and the tavern walls began to take the Linmore situation seriously in a way they hadn't quite before. Not because Elias was more significant than other fugitives, though his literacy made him more visible, but because the size of the reward told them something about how personally Harlan Voss needed this resolved. What no one yet understood, what even Harlan himself did not yet understand, was that the search for Elias and the obsessive quality it was developing was pursuing the wrong thing. The physical body of Elias, wherever he was in one sense almost beside the point. What mattered was what Elias had left behind. And that thing, that slow, patient, carefully constructed thing that Elias had spent not weeks but years creating, was still at Linmore, still in the counting room, still waiting to be found by someone who would know what they were looking at. Catherine Voss went back to the counting room on a Thursday afternoon in early October, when Harlan was at the county seat on business. She went because the question of the clear desk had not left her mind, and because in the weeks since Elias had gone, she had found herself returning to it the way the tongue returns to a sore tooth, compulsively, uncomfortably, unable to stop. She began with the ledgers. She was not a bookkeeper and had no particular training in accounting, but she was a Voss by marriage, and before that, a Crane by birth. And the Crane family of Fredericksburg had always had a talent for numbers. She opened the current household ledger, the one Elias had maintained through the summer, and read through it carefully. It was as precise and orderly as she had expected. Every entry clear, every column accurate, every sum verified by the figure at the bottom of each page. She almost put it down. She almost told herself that a clear desk was just a clear desk, that a man preparing to run would tidy his workspace because there was nothing unusual about neatness. But then she turned to the back of the ledger. In most plantation ledgers of the period, the back pages, the blank ones at the end after the last entry of the accounting year, were left empty. Sometimes used for rough calculations, occasional notes, sometimes completely blank. In the Linmore ledger, the last 3 pages were, on their face, ordinary. Numbers, columns, figures that looked, at first glance, like a continuation of the household accounts. Catherine stared at those 3 pages for a long time. Then she closed the ledger, put it back exactly where she had found it, and left the counting room. She went upstairs to her bedroom. She sat in the chair by the window that looked out over the tobacco fields, now harvested and brown, and she stared at nothing for what she would later estimate was nearly an hour. What she had seen in those back pages was not a continuation of the household accounts. The figures were in the right format, in Elias's handwriting, with the same careful columns. But the categories were wrong. The numbers were wrong. There were dates, spanning 4 years. There were references to people by initial only. There were sums that bore no relationship to any purchase or expense that Catherine could identify in the main body of the ledger. It was a record of something. Catherine was absolutely certain of that. She was equally certain that she did not know, sitting in that chair in the October afternoon, what it was a record of. But she knew one other thing with a cold and growing clarity. She was afraid to find out. If you have been listening to this story, and something in it is making you uneasy, the kind of unease that comes not from the dramatic and the violent, but from the quiet and the deliberate, I want you to stay with that feeling. Because what Catherine Voss sensed in that October afternoon light, without yet having the words for it, was that what she had found was only the edge of something much larger. The most unsettling discoveries are never the ones that announce themselves loudly. They are the ones that arrive in the handwriting of someone you thought you knew. Drop a like on this video if you want to keep going. And keep watching, because what those pages actually contained is going to take this story somewhere none of us expected. Catherine said nothing to Harlan for another 10 days. This was not cowardice, or not only cowardice. It was, she would explain much later in the letter to her sister, a kind of strategic caution rooted in an understanding of her husband that had been developed over 12 years of close, unequal proximity. She knew how Harlan responded to information that unsettled him. She knew the way his jaw set and his eyes went flat when something disrupted the controlled narrative he maintained about Linmore and his management of it. She had learned, by hard experience, to approach such disruptions with preparation rather than urgency. So she prepared. She returned to the counting room 3 more times over those 10 days, each time when Harlan was away from the house. She did not remove anything. She was too afraid of what that might precipitate and too uncertain of what she was looking at to risk disturbing it. But she read. She read those 3 pages with the painstaking attention of someone who is trying to understand a language that is almost but not quite familiar. The figures in those pages, she came to understand, were organized by month. Each entry had a date, an initial or pair of initials, and a number followed by a letter designation, sometimes C, sometimes D, sometimes R. The sums themselves were small, never more than a few dollars, often less than $1. But they accumulated. Over the 4 years represented in those pages, they accumulated to a number that Catherine calculated and then recalculated because the first time she arrived at it, she assumed she had made an error. She had not made an error. In 4 years, across dozens of small, unremarkable individual entries, the total figure came to just over $470. Catherine Voss had been mistress of Linmore for 12 years. She knew the household budget precisely enough to understand what $470 accumulated over 4 years in sums that never once attracted the attention of the main ledger review actually represented. Not luxury, not extravagance. Elias had lived materially with great austerity, as the conditions of his position required. No, what those amounts represented, if she was reading them correctly, was a sum that had been assembled quietly, patiently, in amounts small enough never to register, over a period long enough that the accumulation itself became the point. But the money was not the most disturbing part of those pages. The most disturbing part was the 3 names at the bottom of the last page. Not initials, names, written in Elias's hand, each on its own line, with a date beside each one. The dates ranged from 1854 to 1856. The names were people Catherine knew, or had known. 3 people who had, in those years, left Linmore under circumstances that Harlan had explained as sales, transfers, or in one case an escape that had been quietly absorbed into the general category of runaways who were never recovered. Looking at those 3 names in Elias's careful handwriting, beside dates that aligned with the events she remembered, Catherine felt the floor of her understanding shift beneath her in a way that was quiet, thorough, and irreversible. She went home to her bedroom. She sat in her chair. This time she did not look out at the fields. She looked at her hands. When Harlan came home that evening, she told him that she had found something in the counting room. She told him carefully, watching his face, the way she always watched his face, measuring the distance between what he would say and what she knew he was actually feeling. She told him about the back pages of the ledger. She did not tell him about the names, not yet, waiting to see whether he would find them himself. Harlan went to the counting room that night after supper. He was in there for over an hour. When he came out, his face had the quality she recognized. That particular blankness that was not actually blankness, but a controlled compression of something much more volatile. He said, in a very even voice, that she should not discuss what she had found with anyone. Not with anyone on the plantation, not with any visitor, not with her sister in Fredericksburg. He would handle it. He sat down in his chair in the study and poured himself a glass of bourbon and stared at the fire for a long time. Catherine went upstairs. She wrote a letter to her sister that night. The letter that would survive, the letter that would later become one of the most referenced documents in the legal proceedings that followed. In it, she described everything she had found and everything she had felt in those 10 days of quiet investigation, and she sealed it and hid it behind the bottom drawer of her wardrobe, and she tried to sleep. What Harlan Voss saw in those 3 back pages that night What he understood about them, or refused to understand, or was only beginning to approach understanding, remained for a while longer, entirely his own. But the counting room, from that night forward, was locked. Harlan carried the key himself, and somewhere, in a room or a house or a route or a life that none of them could yet locate, Elias continued to be absent. It was Pruitt who found the first physical object. Not in the counting room. Harlan had locked that and told Pruitt nothing specific about what Catherine had discovered. But in the curing barn, on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of October, when Pruitt was conducting a routine inspection of the equipment before the final batch of the season's tobacco was processed. He found it behind the secondary curing rack, in the wall cavity where the mortar between 2 bricks had been loosened at some point and then replaced so carefully that only the faint vertical seam of newer colored mortar gave it away. And even that required direct light and direct attention, neither of which the curing barn typically received in that particular corner. Pruitt had not been looking for it. He had been checking the rack supports, which were known to be aging, and had braced himself against the wall with one hand and felt the faint give of the loose section. He pulled it free. 2 bricks, just 2, fitted together with that thin skin of newer mortar, and found behind them a space roughly the size of a large book. Inside that space was an oilskin pouch, tied at the top with a cord. Pruitt held it for a moment. He was a practical man who did not, in ordinary circumstances, engage in extended internal deliberation. He opened the pouch. Inside was a sheaf of papers, folded together. The paper was not plantation ledger paper. It was the heavier, smoother stock of writing paper, the kind sold at the stationer's shop in Coopersville. There were 12 sheets in the folded bundle, each covered on both sides in the same careful, controlled handwriting that anyone who had worked at Linmore for the past 4 years would have recognized immediately as Elias's. Pruitt read the first page. He read it slowly, his lips not quite moving, with the expression of a man who is reading something that is expanding very rapidly in all directions as he tries to hold it still. He read the second page. He stopped. He folded the papers back exactly as he had found them, replaced them in the oilskin pouch, and tied the cord. He held the pouch in his hands for a long moment, looking at the gap in the wall with the 2 bricks sitting on the floor beside it. Then he made a decision that said a great deal about the particular quality of Dale Pruitt's moral character, or the shape of it, which is not always the same thing. He replaced the pouch in the wall cavity. He set the bricks back in place. He pressed the mortar, which was not yet fully dry, back into its position. He stood up and finished his inspection of the rack supports and went back out into the October morning. He said nothing to Harlan Voss that day. He said nothing that evening. He said nothing for 4 more days, 4 days during which, by Pruitt's own later account, he slept poorly and ate without appetite, and walked the property at odd hours in the way of a man working through a calculation that keeps coming out wrong. What was in those papers? What had Pruitt read in that first page and a half that stopped him cold and sent him back to replace what he had found? The answer to that question would not become fully public for several more weeks. But it is worth understanding even now, before the full contents are known, what the simple existence of those papers in that wall cavity meant. It meant that Elias had placed them there deliberately, not in haste, not in a moment of fear, but as a considered act of preparation. The wall cavity had been worked on over time, not in a single night. The papers themselves were the product of extended effort. The oilskin was a protective measure, the choice of a man who intended what he placed inside it to survive. Whatever those papers contained, Elias had wanted them to be found. Not immediately, perhaps, not by everyone, but eventually by someone. He had made certain of that by placing them where the deterioration of the curing barn's aging infrastructure would eventually expose them, and by using writing paper heavy enough to endure a season's worth of moisture and cold. Whether that someone was supposed to be Dale Pruitt was unlikely. But Dale Pruitt had found them. And whatever he read in those first pages had been enough to make a pragmatic, unsentimental man sit with a secret for 4 days before deciding what to do with it. On the 5th day, he went to Harlan Voss. He did not take the papers. He simply told Harlan, in the counting room with the door closed, that there was something in the curing barn that Harlan needed to see personally. He did not describe what it was. He used the particular tone, controlled, flat, giving nothing away, that a man uses when he has decided to let the revelation itself do the work of explanation. Harlan asked no questions. He got his coat and followed Pruitt across the property to the barn. What Harlan Voss read in that oilskin pouch required most of the afternoon to read completely. He remained in the curing barn for close to 3 hours, standing near the door where the light was best, while Pruitt waited outside in the cold, sitting on the fence rail, smoking his pipe in the long, slow pulls of a man who has nothing to do but wait for something he cannot prevent. At one point, roughly an hour into this, George came across the yard toward the barn with the apparent intention of asking Pruitt a question about something routine. Pruitt waved him off with a gesture that George, who was young but not inexperienced in reading the moods of authority, understood immediately. He turned around and went back to the house without speaking. When Harlan finally emerged from the barn, the afternoon light was already going orange. He walked past Pruitt without speaking, crossed the yard, went up the steps of the great house, and went inside. Pruitt heard the study door close. He didn't hear it open again until the following morning. The papers in the oilskin pouch, as they were later described in the legal proceedings that eventually became the public record of this case, contained the following: a narrative account in Elias's handwriting, addressed to no specific recipient, running to approximately 4,000 words. 3 pages of dates and figures that formed an accounting record. A second ledger, in essence, parallel to but entirely separate from the official household accounts that Elias had maintained for Harlan Voss. And a final section of 3 pages that contained what could only be described as documented observations, dates, times, names, specific incidents, recorded with the same methodical precision that characterized everything Elias had ever produced. The narrative account told a story. It told the story of the 3 names that Catherine had found at the bottom of the household ledger. 3 people: Thomas, who had been sold in 1854, a woman named Effie, who had been transferred to a neighboring farm in 1855, under circumstances that Harlan had described as a financial arrangement, and a young man everyone called Davy, who had supposedly escaped in the autumn of 1856 and been entered in the records as an unrecovered runaway. According to Elias's account, none of these 3 people had left Linmore through the official channels that Harlan Voss had documented. Thomas had not been sold to the Augusta County farm that appeared in the ledger. Effie had not been transferred to the Hendley property. Davy had not run. What Elias claimed, what he documented with the dates and figures and incident observations in those 12 pages, was something that Harlan County in 1857 was entirely unprepared to confront. He claimed that the money in those accounts, the $470 assembled in tiny increments over 4 years, had not been the only currency moving quietly through the economy of Linmore Plantation. He claimed that what he had witnessed and recorded and hidden in that wall was evidence of a practice that the official ledger of Linmore had been constructed with great deliberate care to conceal. The second ledger, as the surviving document later came to be known in county records, was not simply an accounting of money. It was an accounting of people, of what had been done to them, when, and by whose order. It named Harlan Voss directly, by name, in language that was plain and specific and not amenable to reinterpretation. It named Dale Pruitt as well. This, then, was what Pruitt had read in the first page and a half. His own name, clearly written, beside a date in the autumn of 1855. There are moments in which an entire structure reveals its rot all at once, not through a dramatic collapse, but through the sudden understanding that what looked solid was hollow, that what appeared to be foundation was, in fact, only a carefully maintained surface. For Harlan Voss, that moment came in the curing barn on that October afternoon, alone with 12 pages of paper in a dead man's handwriting. Not a dead man, a gone man. which was, as the weeks passed, and the full dimensions of the problem became clear, beginning to feel like a very different and considerably more dangerous thing. Harlan's response to what he had read was to do what he had always done when confronted with a difficulty. He attempted to manage it. He was not a man capable of panic, at least not in any outward expression. He was a man of method and control were what he returned to now, even as the floor shifted beneath him. The next morning he called Pruitt into the study. The oilskin pouch was on the desk between them. He did not ask Pruitt why he had waited 4 days to report the find. That particular conversation, with its implications about what Pruitt had been deciding during those 4 days, was one that neither man had any interest in having directly. Instead, Harlan asked Pruitt a single question. Who else knew about the wall cavity in the curing barn? Pruitt said no one, to the best of his knowledge. Harlan nodded. He placed the oilskin pouch in the top drawer of his desk and locked it. He told Pruitt that the search for Elias was to be continued, intensified if anything, and that the matter of the papers was to remain between them. He said this in the flat, definitive tone that ended conversations at Linmore, the tone that did not invite response or qualification. Pruitt left without speaking. Over the next 2 weeks, the management of Linmore Plantation acquired a particular taut quality that the people who lived there noticed with the precision that comes from years of reading authorities' moods through indirect cues. Harlan was present more than usual. He walked the property at irregular hours. He spent long evenings in the study with the door closed and the lamp burning late. He reviewed the official ledger with Briggs twice in a single week, going through each entry with a methodical attention that Briggs, who was not a perceptive man, attributed to the general disruption of Elias's absence, and which was, in reality, something else entirely. He was looking for evidence of what Elias might have documented. He was looking for the shape of what the second ledger could prove and for what it couldn't. He was, in the private space of his study, constructing a defense. Not yet for a court. He was not yet certain it would come to that, but for the social and commercial structure of his life, which was built on a reputation he had spent 35 years maintaining, and which was now exposed to a wind he could not see coming but could certainly feel. Catherine watched all of this from her careful distance. She had not been told about the papers in the barn. Harlan had told her only that there was a complication in the investigation and that it was being handled. She had accepted this because she had no choice, and because the letter to her sister, sealed and hidden in her wardrobe, was a kind of private acknowledgement that the handling she was being promised was not the handling she actually believed would occur. What Catherine understood, more precisely perhaps than Harlan, was that Elias had not acted carelessly. A man who assembled $470 over 4 years in amounts small enough never to attract attention was not a man who left things to chance. A man who prepared oilskin pouches and loose bricks in the curing barn wall was not a man who had one hiding place. And a man who recorded dates, names, and incidents in a narrative account with the clarity and organization of a legal deposition had done so for a reason. Not simply to create a private record, but to create something that could be used. Used by whom? That was the question that kept Catherine awake in those October nights. If Elias had planned to flee, and clearly he had, then who had he intended to use those papers? He had not taken them with him. He had left them behind, in a wall cavity in the curing barn that was robust enough to survive a season but not a decade. Hidden well enough to require finding, but not so well hidden as to be unfindable. He had left them to be found by someone, for some purpose that Catherine could not yet entirely see, but which she was beginning, in the quiet and the darkness of those nights, to trace the outline of. If this story is giving you chills, and I suspect it is, share this video with someone who appreciates history and the darker corners of it. There is still more to come. And what comes next is the part that finally broke Harlan Voss open. On the 4th of November 1857, a man arrived at Linmore Plantation who had not been expected. He arrived by hired coach from the Coopersville station, a thin, precise man of about 50 named Warren Aldridge, who presented himself at the front door of the great house and asked to speak with Harlan Voss on a matter of business. Aldridge was, by profession, an agent for a legal firm in Richmond, one of the larger practices in the city, which handled primarily commercial matters for the planter class and the merchant families of the Upper South. He was the sort of man whose presence signaled that something official and consequential was in motion, and who carried his own particular gravity through rooms by virtue of what his presence implied rather than anything he said directly. Harlan received him in the study. Catherine, who had been in the sitting room adjacent, heard the low sound of conversation for 40 minutes before the study door opened, and she heard Harlan's voice in the hallway, shorter and tighter than its normal register, thanking Aldridge for coming. Aldridge spent that night at Linmore. He had travelled from Richmond, and the coach back would not run until morning. He was quiet at dinner, courteous to Catherine, and said nothing that gave any direct indication of why he was there. He spoke about the tobacco market, about the roads, about the weather that fall in the Virginia interior. He was, professionally and completely, a blank. After dinner, Harlan retired to his study again. He was there until well past midnight. What Aldridge had brought to Linmore, what lay in the flat leather case he carried, and which he had placed on the desk between himself and Harlan during their 40-minute meeting, was a letter that had been received at the Richmond firm's office 12 days earlier, and which had been addressed not to the firm itself, but to a specific partner named Hadley, who handled matters that required a particular combination of legal expertise and personal discretion. The letter was not long. It was written on heavy paper, in the same careful handwriting that Harlan Voss had been staring at for the past 2 weeks in the oilskin pouch locked in his desk drawer, and it was signed, at the bottom, with a single name: Elias. The letter did not reveal where Elias was. It did not reveal how he had traveled or who had assisted him. It said nothing about his current circumstances or his physical location. It was, in its content, entirely focused on one matter. It informed the Richmond firm, and through them, should they choose to involve the appropriate authorities, that a full account of certain events at Linmore Plantation, Harlan County, Virginia, had been prepared and deposited in a location known to at least 2 individuals whose identity Elias did not disclose. In the event that nothing was done with this information, further documentation would be directed to additional parties. The letter named, briefly, the nature of the events in question. It referenced specific dates. It referenced the 3 names that Catherine had found at the bottom of the back pages of the household ledger. It was not a threat in the theatrical sense. There was no dramatic language, no ultimatum with a specific deadline. It was something colder and more precise than a threat. It was a notification, the kind a man sends when he has already made all the necessary arrangements and simply wishes the relevant parties to understand that the arrangements exist. Harlan Voss, sitting in his study at midnight with the fire burning low, was holding a letter from a man he legally owned, a man who was, under the law of Virginia and the United States as it then stood, his property. And that letter was informing him, with complete calm, that the power arrangement he had built and maintained and relied upon for his entire adult life was no longer what he had believed it to be. He read the letter 3 times. Then he put it in the drawer with the oilskin pouch, turned the key, and sat very still for a long time. Understanding what happened next requires understanding something about the particular social architecture of Plantation, Virginia in the late 1850s. It requires understanding how information moved through that society, who could speak to whom, what could be said publicly, and what could only be acknowledged privately, and above all, what happened to reputations when certain kinds of information became known. Harlan Voss was, in all the ways that mattered to the county, a respectable man. He attended church. He paid his debts. He had served briefly on a local agricultural committee. He was not universally liked. Men with his particular brand of controlled authority rarely are. But he was respected, which in that time and place was the more important currency. Respectability was the foundation on which everything else rested. And what Elias had constructed over 4 years was a document that threatened to remove that foundation with the precise, measured efficiency of someone who had understood its structure completely. The events described in the second ledger, the 3 names, the dates, the specific incidents documented with such unblinking clarity, were not, in the legal framework of 1857 Virginia, entirely straightforward as criminal matters. The law of that era was designed, in countless explicit and implicit ways, to protect the interests of men in Harlan Voss's position. What Elias had recorded was not, on its face, something that would bring Harlan Voss before a criminal court, but it would ruin him, not through the law, through something older and more immediate than the law, through the social reckoning of a community that could only maintain its own sense of order by insisting on certain visible standards of behavior and by quietly destroying those who violated those standards in ways that were too public to ignore. What Elias had documented went beyond the ordinary violence and exploitation of the institution he lived within, the kind of things that the surrounding community tacitly permitted and willfully did not see. What he had documented was something that the community would not be able to permit, even under its own compromised moral framework. The specific nature of what had been done to Thomas, to Effie, to Davy, the particular way in which their disappearances had been managed and recorded and covered over, was, even by the standards of those who perpetuated the system that surrounded it, too much. The concealment itself was too deliberate, too constructed, too revealing of a consciousness that knew it was doing something the community could not openly defend. Harlan Voss understood this better than anyone. He had constructed the concealment himself. In the weeks following Aldridge's visit, Harlan began a process of careful, systematic management that those who observed it from the outside could not quite characterize. He was not obviously frantic. He was not visibly unraveling. He continued to manage the plantation, to attend church, to conduct his business at the county seat with the same steady-eyed composure that had always defined him. But underneath that surface, which was remarkable in its consistency, something was in motion. He began with the accounts. He and Briggs went through the household ledger, the real one, the official one, with exhaustive attention, looking for anything that could be connected to the dates and figures in the second ledger. They found very little, because Elias had been too careful for that. The official ledger was clean in precisely the way it needed to be clean, not the cleanliness of erasure, which leaves marks, but the cleanliness of a record that had been maintained to be clean from the beginning. Every entry, legitimate, every sum accounted for. The official ledger of Linmore Plantation would stand up to scrutiny, because it had been designed to stand up to scrutiny. And the thing that made it stand up to scrutiny was the same mind that had, simultaneously, been constructing the document designed to undermine it. This was the particular genius of what Elias had done, and it was the thing that Harlan found himself unable to outmaneuver, no matter how many evenings he spent in the study with the lamp burning. He couldn't attack the second ledger by producing the first, because the first ledger's cleanliness was itself, in some ways, the proof that concealment had been practiced. A record this spotless, in a plantation of this size, over this many years, a record with no anomalies, no rough edges, no trace of any of the events that the second ledger documented, was not the natural record of an uncomplicated history. It was the artifact of a practiced, sustained, deliberate effort to produce a version of Linmore that bore no resemblance to what had actually occurred there. Elias had known this. He had known it because he had been the one keeping the clean record. He had been given the tools of concealment and had used them to construct the concealment, and then had used the very same tools with the very same precision to document everything that the concealment was meant to hide. 4 years. 4 years of maintaining both records simultaneously, in the same careful hand, with the same measured clarity, in the same small room at the back of the great house. Catherine thought about this in the long evenings after Harlan went to his study. She thought about Elias sitting at that desk, the desk that she had found clear and orderly on the morning she went to look, and she thought about what it had required. Not just the practical intelligence, not just the accounting precision, the composure, the daily performance of exactly the kind of man that Harlan Voss needed him to be, while being, simultaneously, a completely different kind of man that no one at Linmore had ever been permitted to see. She thought about Ruth's description, the last page of a book no one else had been given. She understood it now, finally and completely. Ilias had not simply been reading ahead. He had been writing the ending. November passed. The cold that settled over Linmore in December was sharper than usual that year. The kind of cold that came early and stayed, the ground freezing by mid-month, and the creek at the southern boundary developing a skin of ice that cracked and groaned in the night wind. The tobacco had all been processed and baled and sent to the Richmond market, and the plantation was in its winter quiet, the work reduced to maintenance and preparation for the following season. Harlan received 2 more letters in November. Neither was from Elias directly. They came through intermediaries, through the careful layering of communication that suggested the network of assistance available to Elias was more organized and more geographically distributed than any single letter could have implied. Each letter referenced the second ledger and the documentation it contained. Each letter noted, with the same calm precision as the first, that the documentation existed in multiple locations. Each letter asked, without demanding, without threatening in explicit terms, a single thing: an acknowledgement, not a legal admission, not a financial payment, not a public statement. An acknowledgement, a private letter, addressed to Aldridge's firm in Richmond, attesting to the factual accuracy of the events Elias had documented. A letter that would be held in the firm's files, sealed against the possibility of any future effort to deny or contest the record. That was all. An acknowledgement, held in a law office in Richmond, in a sealed envelope, by a respectable firm with no personal stake in the matter other than their professional obligation to retain it. The request was, in its design, almost surgically precise. It was not asking Harlan Voss to confess publicly. It was not asking him to face a court or a congregation or a community. It was asking him only to confirm, in a document that would lie dormant in a drawer in Richmond, that what Elias had written was true, that the 3 names were real, that the dates were accurate, that what had happened to Thomas, to Effie, to Davy, had happened in the way Elias described. Just that. Just the truth, written down, stored away, never needing to be used if no one gave it cause to be used. Harlan Voss spent December refusing to write that letter. He consulted Aldridge by correspondence. He consulted a second attorney, a man from Fredericksburg named Curran, who specialized in matters of property law. He spent hours in the study with the oilskin pouch and the original letters arranged on the desk before him, going over the legal landscape with the methodical determination of a man who believed that every problem had a solution if you looked at it from enough angles. What he discovered, gradually and with increasing dismay, was that the landscape was not favorable. The documentation in the second ledger was specific enough and corroborated in enough of its details by the official records it had been designed to sit alongside, that challenging it would require either producing evidence that the documented events hadn't occurred, which was impossible since they had, or challenging Elias's credibility in a legal forum, which required finding Elias and producing him, which no one had yet managed to do. And there was the matter of Pruitt. Dale Pruitt's name appeared in those pages. Pruitt knew it. And Pruitt had spent the past 6 weeks being very quiet, very correct, and very watchful. The watchfulness of a man who understood that his own exposure was directly connected to whatever Harlan decided to do next. Pruitt had not been a willing participant in the concealment, but he had been a knowing one, at least in part, knowing enough that his 4 days of silence after finding the oilskin pouch were themselves a kind of record. In the second week of December, Pruitt gave notice. He told Harlan that he intended to leave Linmore at the end of the month. He gave no specific reason. He had a relative in Tennessee, he said, and was considering his options. He said it in the flat, careful tone of a man who has decided that distance is its own kind of protection. Harlan accepted the notice without argument. That was when Catherine understood that her husband's composure was no longer management. It was exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from the recognition that no amount of effort will be sufficient. She saw it in the way he sat, in the evenings, with the glass of bourbon he no longer refilled a second time. She saw it in the way his eyes, always so controlled, now moved slightly too slowly across the room, as though the act of processing the immediate present required more energy than it once had. She wrote a second letter to her sister in Fredericksburg. This one was longer. It was also, between its careful lines, a farewell to something, to the life at Linmore, to the arrangement she had lived inside for 12 years, to the version of Harlan Voss that she had believed she was married to, if she had ever entirely believed it. On December 23, 1857, Harlan Voss sat at his desk and wrote a letter. It was not a long letter. In the legal proceedings that came later, it was described as running to one page, front only, in a hand that several people who were familiar with Harlan's writing described as looser than usual. Not the practiced, controlled script of a man comfortable with documents, but the writing of someone under considerable strain. The letter was addressed to the firm of Hadley and Associates in Richmond, care of Warren Aldridge. It confirmed, in the specific language that had been requested in the communications Harlan had received over the previous 2 months, the factual accuracy of the events documented in the second ledger. It named Thomas. It named Effie. It named Davy. It named the dates. It said nothing else. It signed Harlan Voss's name at the bottom. He sealed it himself, carried it to the outgoing mail the following morning, Christmas Eve of 1857, a cold and grey morning with ice on the fence rails, and gave it to George to take to the county road where the mail rider passed. George took it without looking at what it was. He came back 40 minutes later, his nose red from the cold, and reported that it had been given to the mail rider. He went into the kitchen. He did not ask Harlan what was in the letter, but he knew something significant had happened. Everyone at Linmore knew that morning that something had shifted, not because anyone had said anything or overheard anything, but because Harlan Voss came in from the porch after watching George go down the drive and went directly to his study and closed the door and did not come out again until dinner. And when he came to dinner, he was different, not broken, not defeated in any visible way, but different. The compression was gone. The taut, coiled quality that had defined his face and his manner for the past 3 months was simply absent, replaced by something that Catherine recognized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold, as relief. Not the relief of resolution, the relief of something being over, of a thing held at great cost being finally set down. She looked at her husband across the Christmas Eve table and understood that whatever Harlan Voss had been protecting for those months, and for the years before those months, had finally, in the form of that single letter, been surrendered. The fire in the dining room crackled. George served the meal in silence. Outside, the ice on the fence rails glittered in the lamplight that fell from the windows of the great house, and somewhere very far away, in a location that no one in Harlan County knew or would learn for some time yet, a man who had spent 4 years preparing this particular moment was perhaps doing precisely nothing, simply existing in a place he had chosen, in a life whose shape was now, for the first time, his own to determine. The legal proceedings that followed the December letter were not immediate, and they were not simple, and they unfolded with the particular slowness of institutional processes in an era before telegraphs had reached every county seat and before the railroad had connected every corner of Virginia to the national machinery of justice. But they unfolded. Aldridge, working with the Hadley firm, forwarded the letter to the relevant county authorities in January of 1858, along with a summary account of the documentation Elias had prepared. The response from the Harlan County authorities was, in the first instance, procedural resistance. The kind of slow institutional friction that existed to protect men like Harlan Voss and had always existed for precisely that purpose. There were questions about the validity of the letter, about the legal standing of the documentation, about the appropriate venue for any proceedings. But there was the document. There was the second ledger, which Pruitt had confirmed the existence of before leaving for Tennessee, and which had been retrieved from the oilskin pouch at Harlan's desk and submitted to the Richmond firm as Exhibit A, in a matter that the firm's senior partner, Hadley himself, chose to handle personally, not out of moral conviction, though it is possible some of that existed, but out of the PR. Professional understanding that a document of this completeness and precision in a case of this specific nature was the kind of thing that did not stay manageable once it began to move. The three names were investigated. Thomas was found alive on a farm in Western Virginia under different circumstances than those recorded in the official Linmore ledger. Effie was not found immediately. Her trail was cold and long. But her absence from the official record was itself, in the context of the other documentation, significantly damning. Davy presented the most difficult circumstances, and the legal record is deliberately oblique on this point. The surviving documents from the Harlan County proceedings use language that is, by design, indirect, but they record that the investigation into Davy's absence was productive of findings inconsistent with the official record of escape, which, in the measured language of mid-19th century Virginia legal documents, communicated more than it directly said. The formal proceedings against Harlan Voss began in March of 1858 in the Harlan County Circuit Court, and were referred to the state court in Richmond by June of that year, when the scope of the case exceeded the local court's jurisdiction. The charges were complex, argued through the existing legal framework of a state and a nation whose laws were not designed for cases of this nature, and they produced results that the historical record does not present cleanly. What the historical record does present cleanly is this: Linmore Plantation was sold in 1859. The sale was a forced one, the consequence not of any single legal judgment, but of the accumulated financial, reputational, and social pressure that the proceedings generated across 14 months. The 460 acres, the great house with its white columns, the processing barn, the counting room with its clean and careful desk, all of it passed to a buyer from Northern Virginia who had no connection to the Voss family and who operated Linmore for the remaining years before the Civil War, made such operations impossible in a manner that the county records do not describe as notably different from what had preceded it. Harlan Voss retired to a smaller property outside Fredericksburg. Catherine's family had land there, and in the wreckage of what Linmore had been, proximity to the Crane family property was one of the few material resources that remained. He did not speak publicly about what had happened. He did not attempt a legal counteroffensive. He lived for the remaining years of his life in a kind of visible diminishment that the people who had known him in his Linmore years found remarkable, not because he appeared broken, he did not, but because the quality of authority that had always surrounded him, that particular quality of a man who believes the world is organized in his favor, was simply gone. He died in 1863, during the early years of the Civil War, of a fever that the records describe as sudden. He was 51. Catherine returned to Fredericksburg and lived with her sister for several years before relocating in 1865 to Philadelphia, where she spent the rest of her life. The letters she had written to her sister, including the one hidden in the wardrobe, the one that had been retrieved and submitted as evidence, and several subsequent ones written during the proceedings, were preserved by her sister's family and found their way by a circuitous route through 3 generations of inheritance into the collection of a Virginia Historical Society, where they remain. Dale Pruitt's subsequent life is not well documented. He went to Tennessee. He does not reappear in the historical record with any significance. Briggs, the bookkeeper, gave testimony in the Richmond proceedings and was not charged with any participation in the events described in the second ledger. His testimony was, by the account of the court reporter, detailed and precise and, in the judgment of the presiding court, consistent with the claim that his knowledge of the official ledger had been complete, and his knowledge of everything behind it had been effectively managed by the care with which the official ledger had been maintained. Ruth gave the deposition that produced her description of Elias, the last page of a book no one else had been given. She gave it freely in Richmond, in a room that she had never expected to be in, before a clerk who recorded her words in the flat mechanical strokes of a man doing his job. She said what she had seen, clearly and completely, and she did not elaborate beyond what she had actually observed, and she was thanked in the manner of a witness who has given useful testimony and then dismissed. George was never formally asked to testify. He had, after all, observed very little directly. He had carried a letter to a mail rider on a cold Christmas Eve morning, and that was the extent of his documented involvement in the legal record. Nora, the young woman who had watched the counting room door through the kitchen window, left Linmore with the sale of the property and disappears from the record entirely. Elias was never found. This is the fact that the historical record offers most clearly and most finally, and it is, in the context of everything else, the fact that carries the most weight. The legal proceedings were conducted, the documents were submitted, the case was argued in 2 courts over 14 months, and the central figure in all of it, the man whose hand produced every significant piece of evidence, whose patience had assembled the entire architecture of exposure, was never located, never produced, never brought before any court or any authority. His letter to the Richmond firm had been clear on this point. He was aware that his return would not be possible. He was not asking for the proceedings to restore him to a situation he had left behind. He was asking only that the record be made, that the second ledger, the parallel account he had maintained across 4 years, be placed alongside the official account in a forum where its implications could not be ignored. This was done. The question of whether it was enough, whether the results it produced were commensurate with what it had cost and with what had been done to Thomas, to Effie, to Davy, is a question that the historical record cannot fully answer and does not try to. What the record can offer is this: the second ledger survived. It was preserved in the files of the Hadley firm until the firm dissolved in 1891, at which point its papers were donated to the Virginia State Library in Richmond, where they were catalogued with less attention than they deserved and remained largely unexamined for several decades. The oilskin pouch was noted in the catalogue. The 12 pages of Elias's narrative account were described briefly as plantation documentation, provenance uncertain. It was a researcher named Alicia Dawn who, working through the Virginia State Library's records in the late 1890s on a project related to the antebellum period, found the documents and understood what she was looking at. She spent 6 weeks with those 12 pages, and with the corroborating letters and legal documents she was able to locate through the court records of the Richmond proceedings. She wrote a long account of what she found, which was published in a small historical review in 1899. The account did not receive wide notice at the time. The years following the Civil War and Reconstruction had produced a particular kind of collective forgetting in Virginia and throughout the former Confederacy. A deliberate, organized cultural effort to reconstruct the narrative of the antebellum period in terms that rendered the human cost of it abstract and remote. In that climate, a detailed account of one man's patient, methodical dismantling of one plantation's carefully maintained lie, was not a story that many people in 1899 wanted to read carefully. But it was published, and it contained the original documents in full, reproduced from the library copies, including the 12 pages of Elias's hand. At the end of her account, Dawn wrote a single paragraph about Elias himself, about what she had been able to determine from the available evidence about his life after Linmore. She had determined very little. She knew he had reached Richmond in the first days of September 1857. She knew he had moved north after that. through a network of assistants whose members she could identify in only partial outline. She knew he had reached Philadelphia by October and New York by November, and had sent his first letter to the Hadley firm from somewhere in the northeastern states. The postmark on the envelope had been deliberately obscured, which was itself a calculated precaution. She could not determine where he went after November of 1857. She could not find his name in any record she was able to access, not in Pennsylvania, not in New York, not in any of the states bordering the North. This was not surprising. A man with his capabilities in his situation would not have moved through the free states leaving a clear trail. He would have used the same intelligence and caution that had served him for 4 years at Linmore. He would have built a new name and a new life with the same care that he had built his documentation, quietly, methodically over time. Dorn's final sentence was this: "What is certain is that he was alive and free, and that the account he left behind, in the oilskin pouch inside the wall of a Virginia curing barn, was not the desperate act of a man driven to the edge of endurance. It was the final chapter of a plan that had been in preparation for years, written by a man who understood with complete clarity both the world he was in and the world he intended to reach." The historical review in which this was published has since been digitized and is held in several university collections. The original documents from the Hadley firm files are in the Virginia State Library. The letters that Catherine Voss wrote to her sister are in the collection of the Virginia Historical Society. The curing barn at what was once Linmore Plantation is long gone. The great house with its white columns was torn down in the 1880s. The land was subdivided and sold and subdivided again, and what it is now bears no resemblance to what it was in the autumn of 1857.